It is no secret that the manual transmission is on its way out. In fact, there are only 25 different models from 15 different manufacturers that are even still offered with a manual transmission right now in 2025. And that number is even less so when you consider the fact that a lot of these cars are basically the same exact model, just being sold under two different brands. And before we start talking about those specific models, I think it's helpful to recap how we got here. The key reason why there are so few new cars offered with manual transmissions is simply because people stopped buying them. Now, of course, there is a little bit of nuance behind that, but I believe that nuance has more to do with automatic transmissions than it does with manuals. There was a time not that long ago where manual transmissions were just plain bad. They were expensive, they were slow, they got worse fuel economy compared to a manual. And in addition to that, they offered no real control over gear selection. But of course, that is no longer the case. In high performance applications, the dual clutch transmission has completely taken over, offering lightning fast shifts faster than any human could possibly dream, while still being more fuel efficient and providing a smooth ride. And even for more pedestrian applications, the torque converter automatic has just gotten really good. And for those cars that are laser focused on budget, the CVT transmission comes in at a much lower price than the manual and still offers a shifting-free driving experience. And this is all not even to mention that EVs don't feature a transmission, at least not one in the traditional sense. So in 2025, there really are no good empirical reasons why an automaker should be offering their cars with a manual transmission, unless they are trying to appeal to a very small subset of consumers who are seeking that additional layer of engagement. And one final note before we jump into this list, just a few honorable mentions for manual transmission cars that were discontinued going into the 2025 model year. First up is the Chevy Camaro that was discontinued during 2024. I was always a very big fan of this car. The LS and the LT engines made it up to a manual transmission. This car was one of the last true competitors for the Ford Mustang. Then we also have the 2024 Mini Hardtop and Mini Convertible. And I'll be honest, I really don't see Minis all that often in my day-to-day life. So you could have told me this was discontinued 3 years ago, I would have been none the wiser. And lastly, for a car that I'm very surprised got rid of its manual transmission, the Volkswagen Golf GTI. So this car and this model line have gone through a lot of changes over the past few years, like kind of discontinuing all of the base level Golfs and only having the GTI. And apparently the manual GTI was a pretty big seller in the United States, but less so in other markets, though the decision was made to can the manual GTI altogether. So now in better news, we are going to get into the cars that are still going to be sold in 2025 with a manual transmission option. And just to kind of lay the ground rules here, we are only going to be talking about cars from mass production automakers. There may be a few hypercars or a few very limited edition models that feature manual transmissions, but that just really isn't in the vibe of this video. And we are gonna work through these alphabetically. So first up is the Acura Integra. Obviously, the Integra nameplate is pretty legendary within the Honda world, and it was awesome to see them bring this car back in 2022 after about a decade hiatus. It is meant to kind of be an upmarket hot hatchback, and since it already shares a lot of its parts with the Honda Civic, and that car, spoiler, is offered with a manual, it only makes sense to include one with the Integra as well. Next up, moving over to BMW, we will kick things off with the M2. Now, the M2, of course, is the top of the line performance model for BMW's entry-level performance coupe. Interestingly, for the 2 Series lineup, if you want a manual transmission, the M2 is your only option. The manual is not offered in some of the lesser 2 Series trims. And with BMW, their M models do have pretty high take rates for the manual transmission, so it makes sense why they have kept it around. Which I think is a good transition to switch over and start talking about the BMW M3 and M4. And I would argue that the average 3 or 4 Series buyer is less interested in performance driving compared to the average 2 Series buyer. In addition to that, these cars are supposed to be higher up the food chain, more focused on performance. So I think BMW would have a stronger case for discontinuing the manual in one of these two cars before they did in the M2. But thankfully, we don't have to have that debate because, again, people still continue to order these with the manual transmissions in high enough quantities that it justifies BMW keeping it around. But in that same vein, a car that does not sell in high enough quantities to justify keeping it around, the BMW Z4. Of course, the Z4 is the product of the joint Toyota-BMW partnership, where the Toyota side of that partnership resulted in the Supra and the BMW side, the Z4. At this car's launch, it did not offer a manual transmission, which I think kind of contributed to the lack of interest in this car. It was subsequently added back in, but overall, that has not helped the Z4 sales. BMW has stated that they plan to discontinue this car in the coming year, so we will be losing one more manual transmission option. To transition over to another automaker, we are going to talk about Cadillac, and the first model being the CT4V Blackwing. Now, this is something I talk about in a lot of my videos and kind of some of the struggles that Cadillac has with its brand image. They make a lot of really impressive performance cars. They're going to be dipping their toe into F1, yet nobody really thinks of Cadillac as being a cool brand. And that is despite them making really awesome cars like the CT4V Blackwing. This car is really meant to be a competitor to something like the BMW M3, and I think it could use all the attention it can possibly get and is rightly suited with a manual. Now, this car's bigger brother is the CT5V Blackwing. This car sports a 6.2 liter supercharged V8, making something like 670 horsepower, and it's also a size class up compared to the CT4. The big differentiator for the CT5 in this segment is the manual transmission. When you look around with the cars that this vehicle competes with, you're looking at the M5, the E63, those cars don't offer manuals, yet the CT5V Blackwing does. To pivot over to another American automaker, we're going to talk about Ford and kick things off with the Bronco. Now, my belief as to why Ford offers the Bronco with a manual likely has to do more with the Bronco's main competitor in the form of the Jeep Wrangler. The Wrangler has a long history of being offered with a manual transmission. Some people prefer it for off-roading or just for having a more engaging driving experience. So with the Bronco trying to really directly compete with that model, it only makes sense that it is offered with a manual. Now, Ford's other product that is available with a manual transmission is the Mustang. Now, the Mustang is really like Ford's most iconic product, and I think they're doing some interesting things with the Mustang right now. For one, is they have very boldly stated their intention to keep the Mustang powered by a V8 engine, and kind of reading in between the lines, mating that up to an optional manual transmission. This is kind of bucking the trend that we're seeing in a lot of the industry, moving to downsized turbo engines, hybrid powertrains, automatic transmissions. The Mustang could be the last car on sale with a V8 engine. Next up, we will pivot over and talk about Hyundai, and they only have one model offered with a manual, the Elantra N. Now, this car kind of fits into the typical lineage of the hot hatchback, manual transmission, front-wheel drive, around 280 horsepower, comes in a bunch of bright colors, and has a burble tune. Kind of tying this back to the Integra that we talked about earlier and foreshadowing some of the other cars we're going to be talking about, the hot hatchback segment, save for the GTI, has stayed pretty committed to the manual transmission, which I think is a good way to transition over to our next car in the Honda Civic. Now, Honda has a very long history of building these kind of front-wheel drive, lightweight, small, hot hatchbacks And the only surviving model now really is the Civic. And while the vast majority of Civics are basically just purchased to be people movers, there still is a lot of enthusiasm around the Civic Si and the Civic Type R, and subsequently, both of those models are offered with manuals. Now, I had mentioned this next car during our discussion on the Ford Bronco. We're going to come full circle now and talk about the Jeep Wrangler. As common as the Wrangler is, I think we can often forget that at its core, the Wrangler is an enthusiast vehicle because people are making sacrifices to things like interior noise, ride quality, handling for the sake of off-road capability. And in addition to that, at its core, the Wrangler really is a Spartan and utilitarian vehicle. It's had a long history of being offered with the manual, and many of their customers today still opt for it, so it makes sense for them to keep it around. Next up, we are going to talk about the Lotus Emira. And as we talk through this list, there are a lot of brands, a lot of automakers that are targeted towards enthusiasts. BMW, Porsche, but there is only one brand who solely sells to enthusiasts, and that would be Lotus. Now, Lotus has made some interesting decisions as of late, coming out with an electric SUV, but the Emira really is still in the ethos of old school Lotus, and as such, it is offered with a manual transmission. Another car that is a favorite amongst enthusiasts is the Mazda Miata. The Miata really is a car from another time. Even when it originally launched in the 1990s, it was intended to be a throwback to the British roadsters of the 1960s and 1970s. And even now in the modern day, Mazda stays pretty true to that original intent of the car, and a quintessential part of that is the manual transmission. But interestingly, the Miata is not the only Mazda product to be offered with the manual. There is also the Mazda 3. Now, the Mazda 3 is kind of an interesting case. It's not a super economy-focused car and therefore gets a manual, but it's also not a hot hatchback and therefore would get a manual. It is somewhere in between. But Mazda, as of late, has kind of had an enthusiast tilt, so maybe it makes sense for them to put the manual transmission in this car. A model that is a super economy focused car and still gets a manual transmission would be the Nissan Versa. With a price of under $20,000, the Versa really is like the perfect example of the economy car that gets a manual transmission. This used to be super common, but as the CVT has kind of started to take over, these have become exceedingly rare, and honestly, the Versa is kind of the last of this type of car. And we have one other Nissan model to talk about, and that would be the Z. And when this car came out, the manual transmission was a big differentiator. This car's main competitor in the form of the Supra at the time of launch was not offering a manual, and I really think we can credit Nissan for pushing Toyota here. And more broadly, I love to see cars in this price range, this kind of mid-tier entry-level sports car, offering manual transmissions. Now, with that being said, the highest performance trim of the Z Nismo, doesn't offer a manual. That car is automatic only, so that is a little bit of a disappointment, but I still credit Nissan. Now we are going to take a look at Porsche, and we've got a few different models to talk about here. We'll start with the 718. The 718, of course, being better known as both the Cayman and the Boxster. It is Porsche's entry-level sports car. And more broadly, Porsche is a brand that is really dedicated to the enthusiast market, so they kind of have an obligation to keep the manual around here. In addition to that, when you look at what this car competes with at its base price, you're also kind of cross-shopping it against a Corvette. The Corvette on paper has a higher level of performance, but the manual transmission here is a differentiator. Now, of course, Porsche's other model being offered with a manual transmission is their flagship product in the form of the 911. Now, the 911 represents the Porsche brand as a whole. Something I'm kind of sad to see is that with the latest iteration of the 911, the 992.2, it seems like they're trying to kind of inch themselves away from the manual by only offering it in either the Carrera T or the GT3. But with that said, Porsche buyers, more than any other consumers, vote with their wallets. So if there is demand for more manual 911s, Porsche will oblige. And this car is really in a unique spot because there really aren't any low to mid $100,000 performance cars that offer manuals anymore. 911's kind of out on an island all by itself. And for a car that kind of shares in the Porsche ethos, but is at a much lower price point, the Subaru BRZ. The BRZ is one of the few true entry-level sports cars. And what I mean by a true sports car is that it is not a hopped-up economy car. It is a purpose-built sports car from the ground up. This car is clearly not focused on all-out speed, and as such, it is offered with a manual, and it has pretty high take rates. The Subaru WRX, on the other hand, is the perfect example of a hopped-up economy car. And that's even as Subaru has kind of steered people away from the manual transmission. With the latest iteration of the car, if you wanted a manual at launch, you would have to opt for the base model, with some of the higher level performance trims only being offered with an automatic. But it seems like Subaru has kind of smartened up as of late and has listened to their customers. Now, this next one may surprise you, but Toyota is actually the brand that has the most distinct models that are offered with manual transmissions. And we will start things out here with the GR86. Now, this car is essentially the sibling vehicle to the Subaru BRZ, so everything I said about that car holds true here. Entry-level sports car, lightweight, compact, focused on engagement. It gets a manual. For what I think may currently be Toyota's most exciting product, there is also the GR Corolla. This is the truest example of the hot hatchback. Toyota saw the success of the GR Yaris globally and decided to make a Corolla version of it for the US. And this car has really picked up the torch of the traditional hot hatchback, as vehicles like the WRX STI and Mitsubishi Evo have gotten killed off. Now, for what I think may be one of the weirdest cars on this list, the Toyota Tacoma is still available with a manual transmission. There was a point in time where most pickup trucks were offered with manuals because it gave more control over gear selection for things like towing, hauling, or off-roading. But as automatics have improved, this has basically all been phased out except for in the Tacoma. Now, specifically with some of the models like the Tacoma TRD Pro, these are more enthusiast-focused trims, and as such, maybe it makes a little bit more sense that it is offered with a manual. And the last Toyota model that we are going to talk through is going to be the Supra. Now, when the Supra launched 5-6 years ago, it was not particularly well received for a few different reasons. Now, for one, it was because of how the car looked compared to the concept car. I think people have largely warmed up to the styling as of now. Another issue was the power figures. Toyota has since upped the factory rated horsepower for these vehicles. The other reason was the lack of a manual transmission, which Toyota smartened up on. And I think that is in no small part to the Nissan Z and the competition that it was facing there. Now, all of that being said, the Supra still isn't a tremendously great seller, but I'm still very glad that Toyota builds it. And now for the very last car that we are going to talk about, the Volkswagen Jetta. And the Jetta really covers the full spectrum, with some of its base models kind of being economy car adjacent, and its sporty GLI trim kind of bordering on the territory of being a hot hatchback. And we've talked about those two segments quite extensively now. The Jetta slots pretty nicely in there for those that are looking for an additional option. So that is our list of cars as of right now, beginning of 2025, that are still being offered with a manual transmission. We can see that the hot hatchback segment is an area where the manual transmission is very much still alive. In addition to that, kind of mid-tier sports cars, the manual is still going fairly strong there, and it is kind of holding on by a thread in the economy car segment as well. Where I think there is the biggest hole in the market is at the very high end, where the Porsche 911 is kind of the only car representing that segment. And while at times things can look pretty bleak for the manual transmission, all hope is not lost. As long as there is still money to be made selling new manual transmission cars, the automakers will continue to produce them.